Welcome to the inaugural lecture of Anthony Klotz, Professor Anthony Klotz, excuse me. I've known Anthony for a long time, and I've constantly been amazed by his both prolific research and the high quality for how many of those, and yet he still seems so calm most of the time. So I think it's probably something to do with the research he's going to tell us about today about working in nature, and that there may be something there, but we'll find out later. So Anthony is a professor of organizations and innovation here at UCL School of Management, and that his arrival here to me was really symbolic for the school. Our feisty upstart business school was able to attract a scholar of Anthony's caliber all the way from the US. That was, I think, a real watermark for us here. And that Anthony has been doing so much important research on people's relationships with work through the lens of organizational citizenship behavior, resignations, and bringing things that normally are outside, inside, like the effect of biophilic design. His research has been published in almost every top management journal, covered in all the media outlets that we've heard of, and that he's perhaps best known for being the person to coin the phrase, the Great Resignation, in an interview with Bloomberg a few years ago, and that has led to him being a messenger for our field and our research out in the media. And that he's also the author of the forthcoming book, Jolted: Why We Quit, When to Stay, and Why It Matters. So please be on the lookout for that when it comes out soon. And that please join me now in welcoming Professor Anthony Klotz for his inaugural UCL Engineering lecture, The Energizing Effects of Nature in the Workplace. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you for that very warm welcome, Colin. He mentioned a book I have coming out, probably not till next spring. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that our very own Dr. Colin Fisher has a book coming out August 28th, a sensational book called The Collective Edge, Unlocking the Secret Power of Groups. And so if you have any interest in group dynamics, team dynamics, you can pre-order it right now. It's available. So again, that's The Collective Edge if you want to go to your favorite local bookstore and get it pre-ordered. Thank you for that warm welcome. As Colin mentioned today, I'm very happy to be here to talk about probably the stream of research that I'm most excited about and the journey that I've been on with it, and to hear your thoughts on it as well. So it's all about bringing the great outdoors into the workplace and thinking about designing our workplaces in a more biophilically friendly way. The week leading up to this talk, you've all noticed the weather outside. I was really excited to give this talk during like perfect British weather, and I can point out the windows and say, this is happening to us right now. And of course the clouds arrive right on the day that I'm going to present this. But it's still, nonetheless, it's nice that it's springtime and I'm presenting this, because giving the same talk in the British winter just doesn't have the same ring to it. And to get us in the zone, and something that I'll come back to later, I just want you to think for a moment, kind of imagine, if you will. Say you had a free weekend this weekend, and you could do whatever you wanted and go wherever you want to go for the weekend, just to relax or do whatever is most meaningful for you. You could go to your preferred space away, whatever that preferred space away might be. Think about that for a second. If you had the free weekend, where would you go? What would the setting look like? And I'll come back to what's in your mind later. But for now, I'd say my preferred space might be somewhere just over these mountains in the background here. So this is Corvallis, Oregon on your screen, which is where Oregon State University is, and really where the idea for this stream of research came from when I was there. Now, just over the hills, that's the coastal range in Oregon. So just over the hills is the Pacific Ocean, and like nice cascading mountain forests leading into the ocean. And so that, at least, is definitely one of my happy places. And when I was living in Corvallis, I kind of lived up here in the corner, and I would walk into work with my wife every day, through these nice treed neighborhoods. And I would notice, like, I don't know if you're a morning person, I'm not so much. I'm often grumpy in the morning and leaving the house. I would find that as I walked through these treed neighborhoods, I would start to feel a little bit better. I would get a little bit more prepared for work that day. Cognitively, I might be a little bit clearer. Might be a little bit better mood, might be a little bit kinder to the person walking next to me as we walked through nature. And I knew there might be a few reasons for that. Obviously, walking has a lot of benefits. Being with somebody that you care about has benefits. But I thought maybe there's something else going on here that's helping prepare me for my workday. Maybe there's something going on with this nature. The other thing I'll notice, this is the College of Business building right here, and I had a view of those mountains. And I would also notice this habit I had of when I was struggling with a problem with my research or frustrating students or whatever it may be, that I would go to the window and sort of stare outside and often feel better, get some clarity on issues after staring away for a while. So I thought to myself, once I get closer to tenure, I want to start thinking about this notion of nature and does it have an impact on us at work. So I just sort of kept my eyes open and ears open to the popular press and any topic related to the intersection of work and nature. And this word, which some of you may be familiar with, was one of the first words that I came across, Shinrin-yoku, which is Japanese for forest bathing. And I saw that there were these stories about taking groups of Japanese executives out into the forest where they would experience nature with all 5 senses on a forest bathing excursion. And what I first found fascinating when reading about that was thinking about the 5 senses. Like, you can think about some of our senses being in nature, smell, touch, sound, feeling, that sort of makes sense. But I thought, taste? They go out and taste nature on these? And it turns out, yes, they do. They actually pick berries and needles along the way and then make a tea at the end and drink nature. And these Japanese researchers were finding that there was just this whole host of benefits that these executives were experiencing when they went back in the office. So I found that really interesting. Forest bathing, I realized, falls under a category of engagements with nature called nature therapy, just the general notion that being in nature benefits well-being if you take a nature break. So I got this term nature therapy. And then I started to see reports, especially from the Scandinavian countries, that doctors, like legit MDs, were prescribing nature to their patients and getting pretty good results for all sorts of not just mental well-being, but also physical well-being issues. And so I thought maybe there is something going on here that we've been overlooking in the management literature. My aha moment came when I dug a bit deeper and came across this famous biologist, I'm sure some of you are familiar with, E.O. Wilson, who had written this book called The Biophilia Hypothesis back in 1984. And essentially, he explains it much more eloquently, but the biophilia hypothesis just is a pretty straightforward evolutionary theory that recognizes that we as a species have spent most of our time in outdoor settings, in close contact with nature. And when I say most of our time, we've only largely been indoors as a species for the last few generations, really. And of course, there are members of humanity that are still spending most of their time in nature. And I read at one point that it was like, if you took our whole history of Homo sapiens and you put it in a week, so you put it in a Monday to Sunday week, it's only the last few seconds of Sunday that we've spent indoors. So like it's not just most of our time we've spent in contact with nature. It's like 99.9 repeating % of our time as a species we've been in nature. And so the theory here is that all this time in nature, even though now we're often trapped indoors, most of us spend most of our time indoors, we harbor this innate desire, maybe even a fundamental human need, we're not sure, to be in contact with the natural world. And so, and there's a lot of research that shows that when our desires, when our fundamental human needs are satisfied, we gain this whole host of benefits in terms of how we think, how we feel, how we connect with other people. And this term, just biophilia, really grabbed my attention, and I thought this is interesting. There might be something here. Then I looked at other fields who had cited this work. And I realized that the field of management was just behind pretty much all other scientific fields that interacted with nature, especially environmental psychology, of course. Public health has been studying this for a long time. The same goes for architecture, design. We're a ways ahead of us on this. And so there's always a contribution to your field to be made if you realize there's a phenomenon that's relevant in your field and everybody else has recognized it except you. And so that's kind of where I thought management was. And then I think the last little piece of this puzzle fell into place for me when I started to open my eyes to the companies that we were studying were investing millions, and in some cases billions, bringing their employees in close contact with nature. So this is Apple's, it's a newish headquarters now. I guess it's been around for a little while, but this is Apple's new headquarters, built within the last decade or so. Now their prior headquarters, if you were to stand above their headquarters and look at Apple's footprint, you would see that the footprint that it sits on is 80% built and 20% nature. So they had green spaces, but the actual footprint of their campus was 80% built, 20% nature. So when they built this, Apple said, we're going to spend whatever it takes to flip that. And we're going to have the footprint of our campus be 80% nature, 20% built. And we want all employees to have pretty easy access and views to the outdoors. That involved expensive decisions, like you can see the street going underground here, putting all parking underground so that you could have this like giant open space in the middle and around the perimeter as well. So fairly large investment by Apple there. Some of you who have been to Seattle have probably seen Amazon's headquarters here. These are the Amazon spheres. So obviously their headquarters is bigger than just this, but at the center of Amazon's headquarters are these spheres, which are kind of like biodomes. Inside there's a lot of local species of trees, wildlife, and so forth. And their employees actually work in these spaces. There's meeting rooms throughout here. And so clearly putting nature front and center in the design of their headquarters. This is controversial. It was supposed to be Amazon HQ2. So what was neat about this design and what I was really excited about was it's called the Helix. And there was going to be a fairly long hiking trail that you could take from the base of it all to the top and have a view over Alexandria, Virginia, where HQ2 is. The reason it's, so during the pandemic, Amazon decided we need to slow down how much we're building. We don't know how much people are going to be working inside anymore. And so this got scrapped. Now, if you remember when Amazon was thinking about building HQ2, they had this like huge nationwide contest where all the cities competed with each other and gave Amazon all these tax breaks and these sorts of things. And so part of the reason that the area where this is being built was excited was because they were going to build this wonderful building and bring up to 50,000 employees here. And that hasn't quite happened yet because this has been put on hold. But sticking to the nature theme, this was going to be like my future first slide was like, look at this new building they built, hopefully someday. It's not just the tech companies. This is Walmart's headquarters in Fayetteville, Arkansas. They just rebuilt their headquarters and they've got mountain biking trails and streams running through it, trying to merge together the outdoors and the indoors. Let's get a little bit closer to home. This is next to St. Paul's, or just down from St. Paul's, is Goldman Sachs European headquarters. One of the largest private parks in the city is up in the sky above Goldman Sachs. Their executive floor is the top level, and so their executives just have to hop up a few stairs and have access to this wonderful park, which all employees have access to, by the way. They just have to go a few more floors. If you walk on Regent's Canal over by King's Cross, you might, or look behind King's Cross, you'll see Google's new European headquarters. This is their ground scraper building. You know how skyscrapers stand up. This one is on a skyscraper on its side, essentially. And we'll have one of the biggest city parks when it's finished up in the sky above Regent's Canal and King's Cross. And let's get much closer to home, like right out the window here. So Canary Wharf has invested quite a bit in the last few years in building a green spine through the campus so that workers, shoppers, people who are here have easy access to green spaces. There was just a new bridge opened this week across the water that gets us, that's part of this project, that brings us even closer to contact with nature. One more example. See if I can click on it. So this is, so Salesforce, largest software company in the world, or one of the largest software companies in the world. Downtown San Francisco, they just have a skyscraper with no green around it. So how do you bring your employees in contact with nature when you just have a skyscraper with no green around it? You build this massive high-def video board that everybody who enters the building has to walk through digital nature on their way into work, whether that's a forest, a snowy mountain, a babbling brook, or a waterfall. And I don't have a clicker. I don't know if I can make this click. That's all right. But you can imagine this being set in motion and water cascading over this door. It's a pretty dramatic effect. And it shows that even fake nature, even representations of nature, can evoke these emotions in us, these reactions in us. So maybe they have the potential to affect us at work as well. So I saw all these examples and I thought, what is this space where work and nature intersect? And we wrote this initial conceptual paper trying to bring together all these ideas that I shared with you, but then with a healthy dose of skepticism as well. So if the effects of nature are there and we can kind of feel them, but they're not like overwhelming feelings per se. And in the world of work, we have a lot of different pressures on us, a lot of different distractions. And my curiosity was like, okay, maybe the first day you walk in at Salesforce and you walk under that waterfall, it really hits you. But as you walk in day after day, does that continue for everyone? Are these effects across everyone? And so we wrote this first paper to say, look, let's get our arms around what this space is and where the limits of it may be. And we started at a fairly basic place. I'm going to warn you a little bit. We started by just saying, let's map out who we're talking to when we're talking about the biophilia hypothesis and work. Because some people come into contact with quite a bit of nature as part of their jobs, and some people don't. And we had to just sort of set the landscape of that. So we said, really, we can create a nice grid here by talking about individuals who either do or do not come into contact with nature because of the context in which they work, because of where they work, what's around them. And there's individuals who do and don't come into contact with nature because of the content of their work, because their job tasks bring them into contact with nature. Let me give you some examples because I think it'll clarify what I'm talking about. So there's some individuals, it's kind of a hard quadrant to fill out. High contact with nature via their job context. They work in nature and they come into contact with nature as part of their job tasks. So a farmer or a forest ranger, perfect examples of this. I'm from the Midwest of the United States. The storm chaser was on my mind for some reason as well. So these individuals probably get all of their biophilic needs met every day on the job. Good for them. There's other individuals, construction workers, package deliverers, car salespeople, who work in nature a lot of the time. They're outdoors, they can see nature, they can feel nature, but their job tasks themselves are not natural, are not nature-based. They're built. This is the hardest quadrant to fill out. Individuals who work in built environments but work with nature. So florists are probably the best example of this. Landscape architects, perhaps, some biologists. But then there's most workers in this last quadrant. Office workers, people who work in warehouses, people who work in manufacturing plants, all of us who work in built environments, and our job tasks don't bring us in contact with nature in a meaningful way. And so if we think about the biophilia hypothesis and that we're divorced from nature and we have this craving to be in contact with it, we made this first prediction that the biophilia hypothesis is going to speak most to people in this quadrant because they're the ones who are spending 6, 8, 10 hours a day in jobs that have them disconnected from nature. And so with that, we zeroed in on these individuals and interviewed some and looked at the data and said, in general, how do these individuals tend to come into contact with nature on a regular basis in their jobs, if at all? And so some people very rarely come into contact with nature as part of their jobs, but most of the individuals we were talking to said, well, there's a few ways. Outdoor breaks is the biggest one. You could probably think back in your past day, past week, and think about the times when you got out in a little bit of nature during the workday. This is really nice because it's a fully immersive experience a lot of the time. A little bit less immersive is our classic plant wall, or for those of us who bring plants into our office, bringing the outdoors inside. It can be really nice sensory experience to some extent, but not as immersive as being outdoors. Next, there's outdoors, but via some sort of barrier. So most of the time that's going to be windows, but sometimes there could be other barriers, perhaps where you can hear outside. You have the window open and you can hear bird song or something like that. So you're separated from those birds, probably for the best, actually. But you can hear the bird song. And then finally, representations of nature, which go back to that Salesforce example, but also can be these more sort of artful, natural forms. Many of us on our screensavers, some new nature shows up every day, courtesy of Microsoft or whoever's programming those. And so you can see there's these different ways that we come into contact with nature on a daily basis. So we made another prediction here, because these, once we bucketed them, we said they really differ in the extent to which they're multisensory experiences. So usually when you go outside, 3 to 4 of your senses are engaged with nature. But when it comes to representations of nature, it's pretty much just always sight. And there's a mix in between there. So we essentially said the effects of contact with nature at work differ in depth and scope. And the effects of being in contact with nature are going to be higher to the extent that they're multisensory. There's actually some research in marketing when you go into like a retail store and you notice that they have a signature scent, perhaps, and there's really like nice music playing and the clothes are set out really beautifully. You're having a multisensory experience, and it actually brings you, you feel more positively about the brand and the experience to the extent that these positive multisensory characteristics are there. And so we drew from that to make this same prediction. And then we took another step and looked at all of those literatures I mentioned earlier, the research in public health, especially environmental psychology, architecture, and other areas, and said, okay, what is nature actually doing for you when you come in contact with it? What are the effects of nature during your workday? And we ended up using the concept of energy, which is kind of a squishy concept for a scientist to try to work with, this notion of energy to capture all of the positive effects that nature has on us in these 4 different ways I'll talk about in a moment. But really briefly, all this theory says is that each of us have 2 different energy banks within us. One is energy storage, like a tank, and the other one is the energy like that we're using in the moment. So there's potential energy, so the storage energy, and then there's in-use energy. And this theory said there's really one tank that we have, and it's mainly cognitive. And in this paper, we said that doesn't really make sense to us, because I'm sure all of you can think of times when you're like physically exhausted, but like emotionally energized, or emotionally spent, but physically energized. And so we broke out this energy a little bit further. And drawing from this prior literature said it's pretty clear that contact with nature on the job should have positive effects on employees in 4 different ways. It should energize employees in 4 different ways. The first is cognitive. And so one of the most consistent findings in these adjacent literatures is that contact with nature restores our cognitive thinking. It sharpens our thinking. And if we're depleted, if we're tired, and we take a nature break, that it's restorative for us, more so than taking a break indoors. And so we hypothesize that it's clear that contact with nature is driving higher levels of this cognitive potential energy. Probably the strongest finding in these adjacent literatures is that contact with nature is a source of positive affect for us. It's a source of positive general emotions. We feel more positive, we feel happier, we experience more positive emotions when we come into contact with nature. And so contact with nature at work should be a source of emotional energy for employees as well. This gets a little less well established, but when we come into contact with nature, we tend to be kinder to other creatures, which includes other human beings as well. So there's something about nature, and I'll explain what that something may be in a moment, that makes us feel a little bit kinder when we're in contact with nature. And then finally, the toughest one, and this goes all the way back to these forest bathing studies that have happened in Japan that have shown that people actually show higher physical energy as a result of contact with nature. They not only feel like they have more vigor, they actually can show that their physical performance is better after being in contact with nature than in a similar situation taking place in the indoors, not in contact with nature. And so some general predictions here that we made, that like the potential is there for contact with nature at work to have these 4 positive effects on how energized employees are in the workplace. But most of this research, and I'll explain in a moment, explains the how behind nature, almost always positive, and almost always in these like kind of perfect conditions. And the workplace isn't a perfect condition. So here's where our thinking started turning and saying like, yeah, contact with nature at work should lead to these 4 positive things, but a lot of the time in the workplace, the conditions aren't right for that to happen. And so that really opens the question about whether investing in bringing employees into contact with nature is going to pay off for these organizations. So one of the most powerful theories in this environmental psychology space is attention restoration theory, and I really like it. So essentially it says the reason that natural environments are restorative is because nature can be enjoyed in an indirect way. So you don't have to use your attentional resources to enjoy nature. The theory is when you're walking through, let's say you want to walk through a field, you walk through a field, it's really beautiful, that you don't have to focus on the natural elements to get the benefits. It happens just because of our innate connection with nature, that we feel better when we're outdoors, we can do other things, we don't have to focus on it. This differs from a lot of other activities that we do, like meditation and exercise, that also have lots of positive effects. You actually have to focus on those to get those benefits. Nature is passively restorative, according to Kaplan. So this exposure to nature works because nature gives people a pleasant, it captures your attention, but very lightly captures your attention. For the most part, it leaves you alone. So pleasantly captivating, yet subtle target for attention. And importantly, natural contexts differ in their potential to be restorative based on these 4 factors. We'll go through these 4 factors and then ask the question, do these 4 factors exist in the workplace? So the first one is kind of at the core of this theory. It's one that I just mentioned. Nature is going to be more restorative to the extent that the nature that is there is fascinating to you. Like it's subtly fascinating. It catches your attention, but it doesn't overwhelm it. So it has to actually catch your attention, but not overwhelm it. So like we're in a room right now with quite a bit of natural elements in it, like especially all this wood paneling. Some of you may have picked up on that and enjoyed it. Others of you may not have noticed. Those of you who have probably taught in this room and been here a bunch, you're not even paying attention to it by now. So will this have an effect? Is it fascinating enough or not? I'm not sure. The second reason that nature is effective is because nature sort of mentally transports you to a preferred place away. It calls to mind a nicer setting than you're in right now. So you not only see the plant, but the plant it may not even be above your level of consciousness. It causes you to think a little bit about a preferred place away. Now, I've never done this before with a show of hands, but I'm going to ask you, when you thought about where you would go this weekend, if you could go anywhere, I want to ask how many of you thought of a natural setting or a place with a nice natural setting? How many of you? Wow. Okay, maybe you were primed by the topic of this talk, but that's essentially what the research shows as well. The vast majority of people, when you just say, what's your preferred place away, they describe a natural setting. So the theory here is that the nature around us reminds us or calls to mind these preferred settings that we would rather be in. The third element, extent, gets to why contact with nature may be connected to us being kinder, more pro-social to one another. Because when we see nature, it reminds us that we're all connected. And it can be, especially when we see a tree or the figure of a tree or roots, we can almost literally see how it calls connectivity to mind and that we're all linked together. And of course, there's a bunch of famous mirror quotes about how all of these living things, all of us as living things are interconnected. And so the thought is that contact with nature brings to mind this connectivity and makes us kinder to other living things. And then finally, there's compatibility, which I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about a little bit later in the talk. And it's the notion that each of us, of course, our personalities are different, and each of us differ in the extent to which we benefit from different types of contact with nature. And so now I just want to take a moment and explain how in the world of work, these four elements are violated fairly regularly, which raises the question of whether contact with nature will have positive effects on workers in the workplace. So first, fascination is most likely to occur in novel settings where the natural element is changing. And in the workplace, like in this room, nature often doesn't change. It's the same thing every day. But more importantly, the elephant in the room, the obvious thing I haven't mentioned yet, is like nature is often demanding. Nature is often really unpleasant. And so if I went and surveyed this person right now and how much is nature energizing you? They'd probably say, not very much. It's actually depleting me because I'm trying to not fall on the sidewalk. And so often our workplaces bring us into contact with unpleasant forms of nature. And these nature breaks that I talk about, let's get out of nature breaks, right? During the British winter, why not go outside and enjoy nature? It may not be an uplifting experience for you. Another thing is, I mentioned that nature allows us to think about these preferred places away from our current workplace. What we know from the literature is that workplaces are often so demanding and oppressive that they don't really allow us to mentally escape from it. The demands of the job and the demands of the people around us keep us from being able to sort of mentally transport away. And so here's this poor employee with an abusive supervisor, and you can see there's a beautiful orchid in the background, and we could probably go, ask her, doesn't the orchid help you, sort of think about this preferred place away? And it's like, no, I have a horrible boss. I have bad working conditions. So the nature's not going to have effects. When other core parts of your job are deficient, which if you've looked at Gallup's recent employee engagement, disengagement surveys, that most jobs have some pretty deficient elements to it. So in many cases, the effects of nature are just not going to be strong enough to allow people to mentally transport themselves. The last one, the third one is extent is all about us, nature calling to mind that we're all connected with one another. But often in the workplace, and I'll explain this picture in a moment, but often in the workplace, there's man-made, there's built intrusions on our senses. There's unnatural sounds that we're hearing. There's people interrupting us. There may be, you're working in a warehouse or a place with noxious smells that come into contact with you. And there is some research that shows the benefits of being in a park are greatly diminished if a plane flies overhead, because it sort of cuts the link, this connectivity that you have with nature. That's not to say that the benefits disappear, they go away. And a lot of people work in open office concepts, and I often see open office concepts with lots of natural elements in them, and also lots of non-natural elements in there. Distractions, different phones going off, sounds, and those sorts of things. So much that companies are making money creating boxes within open offices that you can go in to get away from everything, which is like the least natural thing I've seen. And so, again, in the workplace, this connectivity that nature could make us feel is often thwarted. And then finally, there's a small part of the population, you know, the biophilia hypothesis is true for most of us, probably like 90% of us, but there's some research that shows that there is like 5% or so, 5 to 8% of the population that don't like any aspect of nature or the outdoors. And so contact with nature may actually stress them out. And that last element, that's a bit extreme, that there's 5 to 8% of people who really just love the great indoors and not the great outdoors. But we thought that as a jumping off point for this paper, and it's a little bit easier to study than some of these other ones, we thought that's a great jumping off point to start studying the effects of contact with nature at work, and how do individual differences play a role in who gets the most benefits from nature if we're there. And so next I'm going to move move through three papers that we did coming off of this first paper, where we looked at individual differences and how they play a role in the effects of contact with nature at work. And so the first one was this observation that we had, that because a lot of individuals who work in warehouses, manufacturing plants, office buildings aren't able to come into contact with nature, what they maybe do is they come into contact with nature outside of work, in their evenings. So we had this hopeful thought, like maybe getting outdoors in the evenings benefits you so much that it makes you feel better the next day at work. It carries over. So if you get outside in the evening, does it carry over? So the focus of my talk so far has been employees coming in contact with nature at work. So we sort of flipped it and talked about outside of work. And take your bottle of rosé and go to Primrose Hill and enjoy an evening there. So how does employees' engagement with nature on their own time impact them at work the next day? So here's a fairly simple model that we built to test this. And we wanted to say, does evening nature contact make people feel better the next morning when they arrive at work? And we know there's a connection between being in a good mood at work and putting in more effort on the job. And so can we find this connection between evening nature contact? It's pretty tough to show effects for what you do in your evening the next day at work. And so we had this prediction that this will probably only hold most strongly for those of you who are high in the trait of nature connectedness, that you feel an innate natural oneness with the natural world. Others of you, not so much. So we tested this across 3 studies. I'll show you a picture of one study. The first one, and these are 3 different methods. The first one is a daily study so they get 3 surveys per day for 3 work weeks, where they said in the morning, they said, here's the contact with nature I had the night before. We used a really rough measure of nature here. We just said, how many hours did you spend outdoors the night before? And then at the end of the morning, they reported their positive affect that morning. And then at the end of the day, they reported their work effort. And we measured nature connectedness at the very beginning of the study. Study 2, we surveyed UK-based employees in the morning, and we just said, what did you do last night? So how much did you exercise? How much time did you spend in nature? How well did you sleep? And so forth. Because we needed to control for all these other possible explanations for why you're in a good mood in the morning. And it's because you slept well. It's because you exercised, you ate well last night, like these sorts of things. We want to control for all that. And then we asked them, how good of a mood are you in right now? And we used kind of we just said, how much work effort are you going to put in today? And then the third one was an online experiment with more UK respondents, where we manipulated, and I'll show you the pictures. We said, imagine you spent yesterday evening in this setting. How does that make you feel right now? And we showed them 2 different settings, and we pre-tested these to make sure they were equally desirable, and they sort of evoked the same general reactions in individuals in terms of how pleasant they were. So did you spend your evening, and we showed them a series of pictures of natural evening settings, and then pictures of really nice but not natural settings. And across these three types of studies, we had fairly consistent results, and I'll just show you an example of what those results looked like in one of the studies. And essentially, we could have drawn, we could draw a small positive line through the middle, where contact with nature in the evening had a small positive effect on people's positive emotions the next morning. And that led to them having higher work effort later in the day. But that effect was much more significant, much stronger for individuals who felt connected to nature, who were high in nature connectedness. For those individuals here who feel like they don't have connected to nature, it had no effect. Being outdoors in the evening has no effect. So we start to see, and again, you could think of us saying to organizations, the contact with nature, the investment you're making into bringing your employees in contact with nature, may differ based on these employees' feelings of nature connectedness. So continuing this theme of individual differences in these outcomes, we next looked at, what about creativity? So nature and creativity have been connected for a long time. So your favorite artist, if you look them up, whether it's music, painting, whatever, you could probably find that they were inspired by nature at some point. It's almost like ubiquitous. I was reading like Rick Rubin, who's this famous music producer. He just came out with a book called The Creative Act. And like right up front, he talks about like nature is the ultimate source of creative inspiration. And I thought, perfect. But let's test this and see if that's actually the case. And there's Frank Lloyd Wright, who was always talking about being inspired by nature as well. So is it strong enough to affect employee creativity? So in this open office workspace here, are these employees feeling more creative because nature exists? So we made the argument, yes, like because of some of the reasons I discussed earlier, being in contact with nature should broaden our thinking. If it makes us feel, if it helps us transport ourselves to another place further away, if it helps us feel like we're more connected to others, it should expand our thinking. And we know that more expansive thinking is linked to creativity. So there should be a link that we find here. And we went on to make the pretty intuitive case that this should be especially true for some of you. And of the big 5 personality traits, there's one that's linked pretty heavily with creativity, and that's the personality trait of openness to experience. So if you're prone to thinking open-mindedly, then when you come into contact with nature, you're going to be especially likely to have your mind broadened and for you to be creative later in the day. So that was the model that we wanted to test. We ran a series of studies using different methods to test this. I'll show you a picture of the online experiments we used here, but similar to the last study where we manipulated contact with nature and said, imagine that you work in this environment or that environment, and then we gave them a measure of cognitive broadening and had them do a creativity task. We also got out of the Western part of the world and went to Taiwan and Indonesia and ran 3-week field studies. We're in week 1. We asked them to report their contact with nature at work the prior week. At time 2, how broadened was your mind the prior week? And then at time 3 weeks later, how much creativity did you engage in at work? And then the final study, we went to Vancouver and we were studying consultants who actually had to leave the office quite a bit. And so we surveyed them every day at different time points, asking these series of questions on these 3 elements. Here's a picture of the online experiments we were running. So again, we did pre-tests to make sure these were matched in desirability and pleasantness. And so imagine you spent part of your day working here. Imagine you spent part of your day working here. So they looked through a series of 5 different pictures and then reported their self-expansion and reported their creativity or did a creativity task. We found similar results to the prior study that I showed you, where the effects of contact with nature on this broader cognitive processing and subsequent creativity was positive. but fairly subtle. But for those individuals, those of you who are high in openness to experience, when you come into contact with nature, it really broadens your mind relative to the average person, and that leads to more creativity. For individuals who are low in openness to experience, that's not significant, that bottom slope. So it tended to have no effect on their thinking and no effect on their subsequent creativity. So again, there's this it depends when it comes to the who of nature. One more study, I've talked about helping others a lot. Partly it's because in my other lines of research, I study citizenship behavior and why employees help one another. So I was curious about like, okay, it's hard to get people to help more in the workplace. Can nature really do that? And so will it lead to more helping at work? So some of you may be familiar with self-determination theory, but we went back to the biophilia hypothesis and said, E.O. Wilson said this is essentially a fundamental human need. And we know when people's fundamental human needs are met, they do tend to be kinder and they tend to perform at higher levels. So we really wanted to see, does contact with nature at work make employees feel like their fundamental human needs are being met? And if so, that should lead to subsequent helping, higher levels of helping, and higher levels of performance. This is where this project got fun. I wish I could take credit for this idea, but it was one of one of my PhD students and a colleague who came up with this. We essentially said this effect on whether our fundamental needs are met by nature should be especially strong for people who are low in speciesism. So speciesism is a concept from moral philosophy that essentially says each of us differs in the extent to which we feel human beings are morally superior to all other life forms. So do you believe human beings are morally superior to all other animals and all other living things? Or do you feel that we're pretty much equal? We're all in this together as living beings. If you feel like we're all in this together, we're all equal, then you're low speciesism. If you feel like human beings are morally superior to all other life forms, then you would be high speciesism. So we thought these individuals who are high in speciesism won't get the same benefits of nature as individuals who feel like I'm coming into contact, when I come into contact with nature, I'm coming into contact with entities that are of equal moral value to me. So here's the model we tested in a series of studies. Online experiment, which you've seen a few pictures of. We use the same pictures as you saw in the last study there in the same way. I'm going to show you a picture of the field experiment that we did in Hong Kong, which was successful, but kind of funny how we did it. And then we did also 2 3-week field studies, again, one in Taiwan and one in New Zealand, with 1-week intervals between measurement of those 3. So I didn't go do this field experiment. The students had the contacts and they did it. They did a nice job, but there was the funny element to this is essentially at night. So there were 2 floors, and there were employees, there were accountants, kind of think of lower level accounting in an open office space. So after all the employees went home one night, on one floor, everybody got plants next to their desk. On the other floor, everybody got, I'm not sure what this is. It's pots with office supplies in them, which is probably not the best control condition, because if you came to work one day and you were like, there's pots here with office supplies in them, you might be a little bit confused. But it's really hard to conduct a field experiment like this and to get access. So I was just excited that we were able to do this, even with this sort of imperfect design. But it is like pretty well controlled, besides the potentially confusing part of that. And so we ran this across. So this is a study where our results weren't as consistent across the studies. And one thing I haven't mentioned until now is self-determination theory actually has 3 different facets to it. And so in each study, we measured each of these 3 different facets. So 3 of our fundamental needs are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So I'm showing you the results of relatedness in one study, and this was pretty representative of the other studies as well, although not as consistent as the prior work. But essentially, it tells the same story. Nature exposure led to higher need satisfaction, which led to higher prosociality across the board, but especially for individuals who were low speciesists. For individuals who were high in speciesism, the effects went away. So the theme across these three studies is it depends. Right? It depends on the individual how much you're going to benefit from contact with nature. With some of us having quite substantial benefits, and some of us not so much. And so I wanted to show you the results of a study that's ongoing right now that doesn't look at the who as much. It just looks at a different outcome and studies it in a slightly different way, in kind of a fun way, I think. And it's something that I've been wanting to study since the beginning, and that's does contact with nature make us engage in less bad behavior? And we're going to measure incivility in this paper. Obviously, every paper that's written about bad behavior in organizations talks about how costly it is to have employees being rude, treating other employees poorly, stealing from the organization, and so forth. And so as management scholars, we're always trying to say, how do we reduce bad behavior at work? Because it costs companies a lot of money. But reducing bad behavior is hard to do. And so would nature do this? Well, there's a bunch of really neat studies in public health and educational psychology that suggest maybe. So these great public health studies show that like neighborhoods in which new trees were planted experienced lower violent crime in subsequent years. Infusing vacant lots with greenery reduces different forms of crime, including vandalism and gun violence. Residents living in buildings with higher level of nature are nicer to each other. They engage in lower levels of deviant behavior. And of course, there's a lot of outdoor education classes that children have now, and they're finding that these outdoor education classes have a little bit less fighting between students than indoor classes. And so this led us to believe that these effects, maybe, these are pretty compelling effects. They'll probably carry over into the workplace. And there's this neat line of literature around biophilic interventions, just planned interventions where you bring an experimental group in contact with nature for some period of time, and a control group in contact with the built environment or some non-nature. And it can range from just showing individuals nature, like I've already shown you, to actually making them go outside during the workday, which is what we ended up doing. They've been shown, these biophilic interventions, to reduce stress, improve well-being, so maybe it'll make individuals kinder to each other. So in this study, we essentially thought about the model that I showed you earlier on, this nature at work will lead to these three, and we measured it by saying a biophilic intervention should, and using these more easily measurable scientific variables, lead to higher positive affect, lower cognitive depletion, higher prosocial motivation, like wanting to help other people, and this is the tough one, healthier physical symptoms. So if we make people go outside, they'll actually report less headaches, less backaches, and so forth in the coming weeks. This was our overall model. So a biophilic intervention will lead to those four mechanisms that I just told you, which will actually decrease worker incivility. So worker incivility is like the lowest level of bad behavior at work. It's really toxic, but it just involves rudeness. So you know when, and the hallmark of incivility is you don't know whether the person meant to be rude to you or not. So when somebody says something to you in a meeting that you think was pretty rude or might be a slight, but then you ask them about it and they're like, no, like I would never. That's incivility. These very low level, hard to determine what the person meant, rude deeds at work. So we did this by taking actually a large sample of university staff and faculty at 2 universities in the US. And we split them in half. And so we asked one half to do this. Every day for the next 10 days, spend at least 10 minutes of your day being mindful of nature. Notice the way it makes you feel. It may be best to do this outdoors. And when we got the reports back from individuals, almost everyone in this condition did spend 10 minutes a day outside. They felt like it was best to do it. The control condition, It got essentially the same instructions, but it was just be mindful of human-made objects. Note the way that the encounter makes you feel. It may be best to do this outdoors. The reason we use mindful in both conditions was to take out the potential argument that what we're measuring here is mindfulness. So it's present in both conditions, because it could be that spending time in nature, you're just being mindful, and we know mindfulness reduces incivility. So just a quick quote from each of the two conditions, and we cherry-picked these, but they're pretty great quotes. So biophilic conditions: today I noticed a group of birds. At first glance they looked black, but after a while I saw the iridescence of their feathers changing from black to purple to green as they moved in the sunlight. It makes me wonder how much beauty we miss when we don't look for it. Like, oh, touching. Control condition: so I sat in the corner of my office. I noticed the hum of my computer equipment. The tapping of the keyboard was constant. It felt cool in the room. It smelled of office cleaner. Right? So maybe some of our work days represented there, but clearly a difference between the two conditions that we saw consistently as we had people journal afterwards. And so when we went to look at the findings, what we found was the biophilic intervention led to a lowering of workplace incivility. So that was great, like a direct effect there. We also found that the biophilic intervention had the effects that we anticipated on these four mechanisms. So the biophilic intervention led to higher positive affect, lower cognitive depletion, higher prosocial motivation, and actually lower physical symptoms. So people who were in that condition, who for 2 weeks went outside for 10 minutes a day, reported less backaches, less headaches, less symptoms of colds, and so forth. What was surprising, and you see the red show up here, and what that means is the effects of the biophilic intervention carrying over to workplace incivility didn't carry over through positive emotions, through cognition, or through prosocial motivation. It was only through physical symptoms that we found the effect going through all the way. And so, not that this tells a consistent story to the prior sets of studies, but it says, yes, nature has positive effects. Are these positive effects strong enough to reduce workplace incivility? Yes, to a certain extent, but it's somewhat limited. We're in the process now of replicating these results because, I'll be honest, it surprised us to some extent that physical symptoms was the main path and the only significant path through which this happened. Typically, it's much easier to move these, to get these variables to move than physical symptoms. So there's some excitement and some things to figure out there. So the takeaway from these studies is, for me, like, does contact with nature have positive effects on employees? Absolutely, and us as human beings, absolutely. But we wrote a recent HBR, and we called it kind of like micro nature is the term that we use. Like you don't need much nature and the effects are somewhat small, but over the course of your career, they'll probably add up. So if you need a small cognitive boost, you need to pick up your emotions after lunch, if you want to feel a little bit kinder, nature is a great way to do it. If as a leader, you expect, I don't pay my employees very well, I don't treat them very well, maybe I just need to get a bunch of plants in there and that'll solve the issue. Nature doesn't have that sort of, contact with nature doesn't have that sort of effects. I think what's more important for us as individuals is to just keep this in mind throughout our work days and think about, we are all to some extent designers of our own workday. And so how do you design your workday to put a little bit more micro nature in it? Whether that's finding time to have more outdoor breaks, bringing plants into your office, finding the time to walk over to the windows and look at the Thames or look at the park below you, or even just staring at your screensaver a little bit more during the day when it's got natural elements in it. That's the main takeaway for me. And that is all of my presentation. Looks like we're fine on time. So thank you very much for sticking with me during that hour and thinking about nature. And I believe we have some time now if there's any questions or thoughts that you have, because this is an ongoing stream of research for me. So if you have questions or thoughts about it, I'd be happy to talk about them.